In this video, I'm going to cover the SQL group by clause, which of all the clauses in as part of a SQL query, this one's probably the most difficult conceptually, and then probably the one that causes the most errors as you're writing, the most syntax errors, just because it's difficult to conceptualize it and then write it in a way that SQL can process and understand. And so for that reason, I've split the lecture quite a bit. So this one I'm just going to cover the conceptual foundation for what is grouping, and what cases is it used, what does it look like in the SQL query, just a high level description. And then in subsequent videos or lectures, I'm going to introduce the group by clause through a couple different methods. And obviously you'll see those videos later. So just jumping into the group by clause, really the first thing to kind of understand or to think through is just aggregation in general. So aggregation is a very common analysis technique. So for example, you might be asked to answer the question, how many loans were booked on the first of the month? Which is ultimately an aggregation, right? You're counting the number of loans. You probably have a table somewhere that has loan level detail or account level detail of applications, and then whether or not they're booked. The second question, what percentage of loans were rejected per state, could be answered. You ultimately answer it through aggregation, right? You sum loans, and then you sum rejected loans, and then you ultimately sum the number of total loans to get your percentage of loans that are rejected. So both of those are aggregations. And then per state would be a grouping criteria. But this is, a per, doing something on a per basis is pretty common. The analog that you're likely familiar with if you haven't done SQL yet is a pivot table in Excel. So in Excel is essentially the pivot table is essentially a grouping and aggregation kind of mechanism or point and click kind of method to perform these analyses, and is very common. But aggregation ultimately definitionally will involve performing a function over data points that returns a single summary value. So that's aggregation. When you group, ultimately a single summary value is returned for each unique value that you want to group by. So in this second example, what percentage of loans were rejected per state, you'll have that summary value, percent of rejected loans for each state. And so the grouping criteria you'll have that single summary value for each individual unique record, unique value of state. So you'll most likely, depending on where you're booking loans, right, you could have up to 50 different states. And some example aggregation functions, which I'm more than sure you're familiar with or you've seen, is a sum, an average, a minimum or a maximum, a count, a mode, or a median. Basically, statistical, what are typically referred to as summary statistics, ultimately are performed through some level of aggregation. And these are the ones that I've listed here. Particularly the first four are very common in SQL. More sophisticated statistical measures aren't really. SQL isn't necessarily the place to perform those kinds of analyses. Not to say that you can't, but it gets a lot more difficult to execute those. So going to the next slide, there are ultimately, and we kind of introduced this, there are ultimately two types of aggregation when you consider grouping, right? There's one with no grouping, so you can apply an aggregation function to a specified number of records. And so, for example, you have a table in SQL, you want to know how many records are in there. So you're just counting the number of records in the table. And so you're not ultimately grouping or breaking up those counts into more granular pieces. And then the second example that I have listed here is what is the sum of revenue for the month of October? And this is a little bit more specific analysis, but you're ultimately summing revenue for a restricted number of records that meet the criteria that the month was October. And so it's essentially a subset or a table with a subset, and you're performing this aggregation function across all records in the field. So in both of those cases, you're not grouping by any values within a field. And the second type of aggregation when it comes to grouping are when you have grouped aggregations or aggregations grouped by values in another field. So the function is applied to specified numbers of records for each specified group. And so that's where the grouping comes in. Two examples: for all records in the table, how many records exist for each city? So the for all records in the table just means we're not going to filter out any records through the where clause in the SQL framework, and we're just essentially going to count the number of records and group by values in the city. So you'll have a count of records for each unique value of city. In the second example, for the month of October, what is the sum of revenue for each day? For the month of October would be a filter in or out. So you would first subset your data to only represent records that have a month of October. So that would be a where criteria in the SQL framework. And then the sum of revenue is your aggregation function. So you're going to sum the field revenue or values in the field revenue. And then ultimately, day is how you're grouping. So you're going to sum the revenue for each value or unique value in the field day. It doesn't necessarily have to take that form, but essentially you're going to perform an aggregation function, create a single summary value, in this case the sum of revenue, for each unique value of or each day really in the month of October. And then so transitioning into the SQL, how this looks in SQL. The top right again is our query that we've been working with quite a bit here throughout this course. And so we're counting, right? This count star would be count all fields. And you're ultimately going to count, I shouldn't say that it's count all fields. Count star is kind of a bit of a difficult to wrap your head around. You're ultimately counting the values within all fields. So you're counting the number of records essentially. And then we're also going to return values for the field city. We're limiting our output to the state province ID, values of state province ID that are equal to 79, and we're grouping by values in the field city. And so what that means is that for each city, we're going to count the number of records that have that particular value. And then we're ultimately going to order the output by those values for city. And so we're going to end up actually running this query here in a minute, just to see what the output looks like and how this is all working. So just to dive into the group by clause specifically in SQL, it follows the where clause. Like the where clause, you can't use column aliases that you might be using in your select list, right? And why is that? Because the processing is ultimately performed on the table source. And so because those column or fields don't exist in the table source, SQL can't, essentially it doesn't find what you're trying to tell it to look for. And so all items in the group by clause must be ultimately fields or modifications of fields from the table source. The group by list specifies the items whose values will be grouped in the output. So in this particular example, for each value of city, we're going to perform this aggregation count the number of records. You can group by multiple items separated by a comma. So grouping by unique values across two or more fields. We'll show some examples in another lecture. And then as with the where clause, again, this is kind of repeating what we had up here. You cannot use aliases within the group by list. For grouped aggregations, each record represents a unique combination of values for items in the group by list. And so I talked a little bit about that. When you're grouping by multiple items, it's really a unique combination of values across two or more fields. For this particular example, the aggregation grouped by the field city will return a record with the result of the aggregation for each value of city. So what does that mean? Your number of records is ultimately going to be the number of distinct values for the field city. And so for each distinct value of the field city, you're going to have a number of records that ultimately have that value. And then now I'm just going to jump over to SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to need to copy and paste this query here and just pull it up. Bear with me. And so I'm going to run the query as is, and then we'll take it kind of step by step. So put the query in the script. I do need to change the database reference. Again, this is something that you can remove and supply through the use keyword. But I'm going to run the query and see the results. And so remember, and actually I'll walk through that part. We'll just dive right into the results. So we have count star is the first item in our select list, so that will be the first field in our output. And then we have city, which is the second field in our output. And notice that for the values of city, you will never find a duplicate in this list, at least for this particular query. It is possible to make a mistake and have duplicate output. But in general, like I was saying before, you're only going to have unique values for your grouping fields. And so we see, for example, Ballard has 69 records with the value. So there are 69 records in the person.address table, where that state province ID, that value for that field is 79. So there are 69 records that meet that criteria that also have a value of Ballard for the field city. So we're essentially saying, answering the question, how many records exist in the data that have a given value for the field city. So I'm gonna step through this a little bit more without. So we'll focus on kind of Anacortes and Ballard, which are the first two cities in the list. And so first thing I'm going to do, I'm commenting out all the clauses, right? And actually need to comment out that select list, because otherwise it'll actually, let me just do it. So anytime you have an aggregation function and then a field that is also not an aggregation, so that SQL is basically going to be looking for a group by clause, you'll return an error, and it tells you that this field city, right? This is how you refer to a field, or how SQL refers to a field, with the table reference, the schema reference, database reference, schema reference, table reference, field. And it's telling us it's invalid in the select list. So it's invalid up here because it's not contained in either an aggregation function. So it isn't itself being aggregated, and it's not contained in the group by clause because we don't have one. We've commented it out. So SQL will return an error. So what I'm going to do instead is select star and comment out. So we're just looking at this table. Again, this is never a good idea if you don't know what the data is, because we're returning all 19,000 records here. SQL doesn't have a problem with that, but if your table's millions of records, you might hang up your own computer or even possibly the server. So just taking a look at this, right, we're looking at values of field city. We see quite a few for Bothell, right, just off the top. That's the first 21 records. So we know there are at least 21 records for the field Bothell. But we start to go down and we start to see that state province ID has values other than 79, right? And so in this particular query, we're restricting just to records where there's a state province ID of 79. And so if I do that, one thing before I do that, so we did note in this lecture that you can ultimately perform aggregation functions without grouping. And so this is one such example. Count star, counting the number of records for all fields from this particular table. We do that, and we'll find that there are 19,614, which is the same result displayed in the bottom of the output window when we just select all records for all fields. So just wanted to point that out. And what I'm going to do is introduce the where clause with that single aggregation. There is no grouping criteria, so SQL will not have an issue with this, but it will tell us ultimately how many records have a state province ID with value of 79. And so that is ultimately 2,636 records. And then we're going to start grouping, right? Let me introduce the order by clause so that we can see. Well, first I'm not going to introduce the order by clause and just output all the records. We'll see how that looks. So we see state province ID is always going to be 79 for all 2,636 records. We're going through the values here. We see Bothell, right? We see Seattle, Kenmore, Snohomish. And so, right, we don't necessarily have these in alphabetical order, so we can't just sit here and count. There are going to be 21 records of Bothell because we already see there's a record down here. So if we wanted to kind of replicate what a group by will do, count star and grouping by values in the field city, we can kind of get an idea here. So Anna Cortez, if you remember from when we ran the original query, there were 3 records, right? The value of 3 was returned for count star, meaning there are 3 records for the particular value of Anna Cortez for the field city. And then Ballard had, I can't recall what it is off the top of my head. We can run this, and then we can actually run the same query side by side and focus on the record level and then how we get to the group or the aggregated level. So I'm going to run this query. I did want to point out one thing, right? No column name. SQL does not require column names in the output, but there isn't a default field name, right, for the output because this is ultimately an aggregation function. So this field doesn't exist in the table. So therefore, no output no name for that field is returned in the output. And so we can supply an alias to ultimately make the output a little bit more readable, understandable, interpretable. So we're going to run this query and then together with the original query without the grouping criteria. So when we do that, let's just expand the list here for the output. So we see, right, we start to see values in the second query, which aggregates, counts the records grouped by the field city. We can see various counts, a number of records. So we do find the number of records for the value Anna Cortez for the field city is 3. Ballard, it's going to take a while to count all these, but there would ultimately be 69 records for that. Bellevue is 41, right? And if we go down, let's just check another one, Carnation. So if we just scroll, we can ultimately see, I skipped over it, there are 5 records with the value of Carnation for the field city. And again, remember that this is restricted to values for state province ID of 79. And so if you think about that conceptually, it is possible that this field or this city name exists in some other state or some other province. So you might not necessarily, without that where clause, you might not necessarily have 5. You might have, you would have at least 5, but you might not necessarily have 5 because you might have Carnation and a state province ID of 78, for example. And so that really is kind of a brief introduction to the group by, how it looks in SQL and how it's kind of working. And again, this was just kind of a conceptual high-level overview. What is an aggregation? What is an aggregation with grouping? And then what ultimately does the syntax look like in a SQL query? And what does the output look like in a SQL query?